Good morning, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to DevOpsCon Munich 2022. It's so great to see so many people right here in the Keynote hall, and it's so great to be back here in Munich. I remember it's been 3 years since we've been the last time here in Munich for DevOpsCon. Meanwhile, we at SNS Media, we've done a lot of conferences in many different places, etc. But I say this is a special one because it's the last conference of the year, probably for you as well. It's going to be really a great and inspiring festival of things around DevOps. And as I said, it's good to be here. And of course, it's good to know that also so many people are joining us remotely because, as you know, this is a hybrid conference. We got people here on site, but not only you, we got also a community following this conference remotely. So that means all sessions and workshops are being transmitted in real time so that a lot of people can also follow the topics here. My name is Sebastian Mein, and I care for SNS Media, the company behind this and many other conferences for content and program. And it's my honor and my pleasure to guide you through this conference today and tomorrow. Before we get a little bit deeper into the program of this conference, let's first of all have a short look on the platform where you've all registered. If you're coming from non-German speaking countries, we guided you to DevMu, our international platform for constant software learning and software know-how. And if you're coming from German-speaking countries, we guided you to Entwickler.de, which is the German language part of the platform. This platform is kind of the platform where this conference is hosted digitally. And this is the place where you could get some information and some advice in advance before the conference started. For example, special workshop information and requirements. You could also log in there after your digital check-in and select your favorite sessions and prepare a little bit for the conference and all those things. During this conference, DevMu or Entwickler.de, whatever you choose, is your companion for, well, navigating through the program, for giving feedbacks to the talks, for using the chat and talking to other peers during the sessions, or talking to our wonderful experts. After the conference, this is also the place where you can download your slides. If you like to review them afterwards, you can download your personal certificate. And if you're a subscriber of the platform, you can also look or watch the videos some months after the conference. But it's not only that. We really want this platform to be, and that's what we offer as a software know-how platform, a continuous learning experience. So if you're a subscriber, you can log in, be it the mobile app, be it the web app, and receive tons of information, not only about DevOps-related topics, but also about many different software development stacks and lots of software technology. So please feel invited and have a look to this ongoing tech and knowledge and know-how experience. Right. As I said, this is available in the browser as a web app as well as in a mobile app. And so I highly recommend all of you, of course, especially when you're here in the room, to download the app and go to the event in order to find your sessions, in order to give your feedback to all the sessions you are visiting, and in order to even watch sessions in the video broadcast on mobile if you like to do that, and all that kind of things. All right. Here's some special information especially for you when you're following this conference here in the Hilton Hotel in Munich. It's very simple to navigate here. All the sessions are either here in the Ballsaal, this is B, there's A, and there's C. Then, of course, in this direction, there's the expo area where you find refreshments and lunch breaks and coffee breaks and all that kind of stuff. And last but not least, of course, our wonderful expo with so many partners offering interesting services and technologies. If you go through the expo area, then there you find on the ground level and at the first level the other session rooms, Rumford, Picasso, Dali. No, Picasso, Dali, so there's a combined room. I don't know how Picasso and Dali fit together, but anyway, and Renoir. So those are the rooms where you find more sessions during this conference. And as I said, don't miss to download and to install the mobile apps for iOS and Android, for navigating through the program, for giving feedback, and of course, for also answering the final survey about your overall conference experience, because we are keen on learning what you liked about this conference and what we can even improve. For you following us remotely, also some information. Obviously, you logged in onto our platform, and from there, there's a landing page. There you can go over the program overview, that kind of things. You can go to program detail. Here you find your video player, and here you find the chat, which I already mentioned. And this chat is really important because this gives you the opportunity to, to take part of the community, to contribute your thoughts, and of course, to ask your questions. The sessions will be moderated, so there will be somebody supporting the speakers, watching the chat, and in case you're asking questions, somebody in the room will have a look on it and will read it so that your questions or your remarks are being answered during the sessions. So don't forget, this is a real-time experience for you, and if we feel invited to contribute your thoughts to that overall conversation during this conference. Last but not least, of course, give your feedback right here, as I already said. There's also another interesting feature. If you go to a detailed view of a speaker on the platform, you can chat, you can initiate a one-to-one chat between you and this particular speaker if you like to have a conversation or ask more questions. And at the upper right hand, you also find your overall message center with all your conversation you are having. Last but not least, of course, all the sponsors who are kind of a part of this DevOps festival, which you can find physically over there, are also represented on our platform. And you can go there and you can meet some detailed information about them. You can have a look what they are presenting, what kind of sessions they are presenting, if so. And you can also chat to them directly if you like to ask a question. Of course, those folks at the session booth are being notified and are happy to get into touch with all of you. There's also some raffles, because it's also nice to win some nice stuff and gadgets, etc. For example, if you are here, there is a raffle in the expo. You receive those little cards. If you go to a certain number of partners, then you receive some. What is Stempel of English? Some, you know, okay? And then you can win interesting stuff, not only a ticket for next year's DevOpsCon, but also some other interesting gadgets, books, whatever. Secondly, for you onliners, of course, there's also the opportunity to win, and we are going to have those raffles, those tombolas, during the lunch break tomorrow, and after lunch break for you onliners right here in the keynote hall. Okay, let's speak a second about, or more than a second, about the conference program and the overall idea of this conference, but not only of this conference. Let's start about how everything has started. Of course, you remembered there was this, more than 10 years ago, there was this idea of, wow, how about bringing the application development and operations a little bit closer together? How about engaging a really valuable conversation between the two of them? How about establishing processes which really make sense and which really give both parties an insight about the needs and the motivations of the other parties in order to have a better understanding? From today's perspective, of course, this is kind of the trivial interpretation of DevOps, yeah? Because now we've become more in a situation where we would say, okay, on the one hand, we have this, let's say, Cambric explosion of technologies for automation, for cloud provisioning, for containerization, lots of tools for automating software processes. So it's such a big ecosystem of stuff which is happening there, which on the one hand really generates lots of advantages, but on the other hand, which also generates some technical challenges, of course. On the other hand, we got people, social systems. We got people ideally in the DevOps sense, following, let's say, some agile values, some agile approaches or methods. The overall DevOps narrative says, okay, it's not a bad idea to treat them kind of autonomously so that they know what their business goals are, but they should find out locally how to achieve those given goals and all these kinds of things. And last but not least, it's not only about software development versus or software development talking to operations. How about taking that metaphor of exchange and communication and transfer it also to marketing, to customer support, to user experience, to security, to testing, and all those other disciplines. And finally, of course, many organizations, as you probably know, came up by saying, okay, how about combining all those functions, right, in teams which are not kind of separated by disciplines, but which are kind of focus on a certain customer need. Of course, it depends. This is not a religion. It depends on your decisions, your organization decisions, how to deal with that kind of ideas. But there are so many rich ideas in the DevOps universe, and there are so many interesting experiences which many, let's say, pioneering organizations have already done. So it's worth to have a look on that. And I can promise you, you're going to have a look on many of those experiences during the next few days. So DevOps is, on the one hand, I would say also the interaction between technical and social systems. And that's what it makes it really interesting. Well, the big promise of DevOps is, of course, to make everybody happy. Wow, super. Automation, as I already said. Secondly, of course, in a world, on the one hand, which is kind of more volatile, maybe than the previous worlds have been 10, 20, 30 years ago. We are globalized, we got the internet and all these things. On the other hand, of course, we need to follow more now the customer's needs. So it's really important to react and to understand the signals which are coming from customers, user behaviors, whoever the user is. And last but not least, one of the promises of DevOps is also to make our people who work on that kind of, let's say, products, systems, processes, to make them more happy. Because it makes more sense. You achieve more. You are able to have a better impact on things. So it's a very big promise, and sometimes, to be honest, I'm asking myself, oh, maybe they promise a little bit too much. Because in the normal world, we are used to have trade-offs. And here, the DevOps says, no, better business, happier people, everything good. Yeah? Well, in reality, it's a little bit more problematic, but it's really worth to have a look on it, and it's really worth to have a conference about that and to celebrate the next 2 days talking about all these things. This leads to program tracks at this conference. I made a list of them here. The first row is about, let's say, the operations, the infrastructure side. You find in those tracks lots of sessions over the next 2 days. And then, of course, secondly, it is let's say, the people and the process and the team side, plus also, of course, the software architecture side. Well, in this context, I'd like to highlight 2 of them. And this is the Metrics and Measurement Day, which is today. And this is also the Developer Experience Day, which is today. And for that, I'd like to invite Julia Wester and Michael Hofmann on stage. They curated those 2 days. Hello, Julia. Hello, Michael.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thanks.
So, Julia, metrics and measurements. So I remember a spontaneous conversation we had 1 year ago, something like that, because I learned, you're focusing on, let's say, not only anecdotal wisdom in the DevOps field, but also about giving things kind of a scientific foundation, about measuring and taking, of course, some insights from that. What can we expect from your day?
Yeah, thanks so much. So we have 5 different talks spread out through the day, and they are going, you can see them up here on the slides. They're going to talk about everything from using your data to get rid of activities that take up your time and being able to answer things like, when will stuff be done? We're going to be talking about progress on the 3 ways of DevOps and lots of stuff in between. We've got theoretical talks about how to, or not theoretical, but how to do, so tutorial kinds of talks, as well as customer or user experiences for using some of these techniques. And what we want to do is take some of the same rigor that you have around instrumentation and operability and looking at data within your technical systems and understanding how to move beyond just qualitative data and look at the quantitative aspect of it as well. Rub a little science on it, as Nicole Forsgren would say, and be a little more scientific about how we look at our systems, how we go about improving them, and understanding if what we're doing is actually making an impact. So I want to welcome you to any one or all of these talks today. I'm sure there will be lots of themes that will run through each one, but each one is a standalone talk, and so you can pop in and out of the track at any time. Thanks.
Cool. So if you feel like this is the day I should follow, then follow all the sessions. If you think, I should go there selectively, of course, this is also open for you. So the choice is up to you, but it's really the idea of having, let's say, a line of tracks which are kind of, which are deeply aligned to each other, right?
Exactly. Like I said, this is a way to help bring us focus on how to measure things that are really about the people and process portions of the DevOps experience, because we spend a lot of time focusing on the measurements of our technical systems. So this you will find more about the people and process. And occasionally, as you mentioned, there's crossover. You can't have one completely separate from the other. So we'll touch on maybe aspects of that go into technology, but it's really based around the people and process side. And so we wanted to call that out because we wanted to make sure that we took a concerted effort to give you a group of talks about that particular topic.
Cool. Thank you very much. And this is also, I think, it's really important because this is, let's say, I would consider this as one of the next steps in the DevOps debate, right?
Absolutely. I mean, DevOps, in a way, but it's a way to think about working in systems, right? DevOps is handoff between Dev and Ops, and as we start to look at our workspace more as a system, we're going to have to learn how to take a more scientific approach to how to work across departments and other people and work with other people's processes, and so this really is sort of the next level, taking it wider.
Cool, thank you. Michael. DevOps Experience Day. I remember we just once said in a previous conversation, or maybe it was just my view, something like, we promised the people automation, but we gave them a configuration hell. Yeah. Is this the thing what happened?
I think that's true, because if you develop for a cloud platform, you have to develop on this platform and you have to operate on this platform. You get new workflows and you get new tools to get your work done on these platforms. And that's the reason why we collected some ideas about new tools or new workflows you can use to manage your work better. We have 3 sessions and 1 panels at the end of the 3 sessions. The first one is on continuous, on CD of legacy code. How can you bring your legacy code to the cloud? Second one is a GitOps operation. Why? Why should we use GitOps? Why should we do this? And the third session is, I will show you a new way to get your software into production. It's based on a service mesh tool. You can do a lot of things with this. And after these 3 sessions, we have a discussion, a panel discussion, where you can go more deeply into the topics you have heard before in the 3 sessions.
Cool.
Maybe this can help to get your hell of configurations, hell of toolings, hell of not being fully automated, a little more compensated.
Cool. So thank you very much, Julia Wester and Michael Hoffmann. All right. So there's one more program announcement I have to do. Tomorrow in the afternoon, there is, as part of the main program of the conference, there's a half-day workshop deploying and managing Kubernetes at the edge. If you're interested in that, this is happening tomorrow in the afternoon between 3:15 and 5:15 in the afternoon. Please register today before 5 p.m., 17 Uhr, because the number of seats is limited to that workshop, because those speakers need to pre-install some server or cloud instances, etc., etc. So if you're interested in visiting that particular workshop during the main conference in the afternoon, in general, it's open to all of you, of course, but please pre-register so that people can prepare their stuff. And the number of seats is limited up to, I think, about 25. So if you're interested, book it now. Okay. So this has been kind of the welcome thing, and now it's my honor and my pleasure to announce the very first keynote of this conference. Our keynote speaker, Jabe, is a long years researcher in systems. He's a consultant and, of course, a well-known DevOps expert, and he's talking about the things I've seen, how DevOps is evolving in practice. Please welcome Jabe Bloom.
Thank you, Sebastian.
And I do not forget to switch the presentation.
Excellent. Good morning, guys. I usually like to say when I come to Europe, my brain thinks it's 3 a.m. right now, so sorry about that. I'll do my best. Really quickly, my name is Jabe. I'm getting my PhD. This is my 8th year. I like to tell people that I could have graduated from college and high school in that time. In the United States, at least. I'm writing my dissertation on something called transition design, which has to do with how social systems and technology and design work together to change the way we organize, the way we live, our experiences. When I'm not doing that, when I'm not getting my dissertation, I work with a bunch of muckety-mucks. I work with Kevin Baer, who wrote the Phoenix Project, and Andrew Clay Schaefer, who is an old-school DevOpser, and in a company called Ergonotic, where we help people reorganize. So Ergonotic is work, navigation, ergonotic. So that's what I do with myself. My talk, really quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about the beginnings of DevOps, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the shifts we're seeing around product management and platform. Then I'm going to talk about a little bit about operating models, and then I want to talk a little bit about how I think the DevOps conversation is expanding. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about the culture of learning that we see in effective DevOps adoptions that we work on. Really quickly, before I do this, is Chris out there somewhere? Chris giving a keynote tonight? Everybody, that's Chris back there. I'm going to talk about the beginnings of DevOps. Chris was there. Chris helped organize the first DevOps Days. You guys should go see his talk tonight at 7 o'clock, I believe, on observability. And if you can find Chris, you should talk to him about what he observed at the beginning of the DevOps movement, because he has been there the whole time. So that's kind of cool to have somebody like that in the audience. So really quickly, in the beginning, we had this, right? We had this thing where, the kind of classic way of saying this is we had silos. We had two different communities. If you wanted to go to an ops conference, you'd see a bunch of people who were doing ops things, if you could find an ops conference. If you wanted to go to a dev conference, you'd find dev people. And inside the organization, often you'd have the same split, right? These people didn't talk to each other very much. The developers would develop something, and they would give it to the operators to operate it. They didn't talk to each other very much. There's lots of reasons for that, but one of the ways we solved this was we created what Andrew Clay Schaefer likes to call a wall of confusion. So instead of like developers talking to operators, developers would write down what problems they saw and put them in a ticketing system, kind of like playing telephone with people. Like, I'm going to just pass a message to you and hope you understand what the message is. We don't need to actually speak to each other about it. It's just kind of like write down what's the problem. And then we would communicate back and forth through this wall of confusion. So it's not just, in this model, it's not just that we threw things over the wall. Is that once we threw things over the wall, the only way to communicate what was thrown around over the wall was passing messages across the wall. We didn't actually talk to each other. Yeah? And so this creates lots of confusion in the organization, creates lots of frustration. The operators get more and more frustrated because the developers deploy more code faster and faster and faster as agility starts kind of taking it on board. And the operators basically make the wall harder and harder to throw things over. They make it harder to deploy in order to protect the operations system. Yeah? So this ends up being a pretty big problem. So I like to think that one of the key things that DevOps did was to reframe that problem. One of the key things that it did was it asked this kind of interesting question. What if instead of thinking about problems as something we write down and pass to another team through a ticketing system, what if instead we thought of it as an opportunity to have a discussion? So the problems now become an interesting thing to have a discussion around, as opposed to being something that gets kind of specified and written in documents and passed back and forth. What if that was the way to improve software development, was to have conversations across this boundary? And so what we get is this kind of interesting overlap, right? We get this, the way that developers and operators start talking to each other about their shared problems, technologies, and practices. I also like to really quickly point out that that doesn't mean the developers were sharing all of the practices with the operators, and it doesn't mean the operators were sharing all their practices with the developers. It was an overlap. Yeah? It was what they shared that started being talked about. So I like to think of like the first DevOps days as just being like a way of offering a space for the developers and the operators to finally start having these conversations and to make progress. And I think, based on the fact that we got a bunch of people in this room, and DevOps is now, I think we're talking like 13 years old, I think. 2009, I think, was the first DevOps days. My math is terrible, but anyway. We saw this kind of Cambrian explosion. New ideas, new technologies, new practices coming out of just this interaction between these two communities together. And some of the interesting thing that comes out of it are things like the ideas of immutability, ephemerality, zero touch, and as code repositories. Right? So the ideas here are around rethinking the way that infrastructure and operations can better work with the way that developers work, but not just that, but adopt some of the technologies and practices that developers have been using for a long time in operation, right? So that one of the things we see is this way of like moving towards kind of a faster, more iterative idea of infrastructure and platform. And one of the reasons we see this being important, so John Allspaw also, I love this talk, this conversation that, or this idea from John Allspaw. John Allspaw did this talk where he talked about working at Flickr, and the talk was called 10 deploys in a day. So this is 2008 or 2009, right before the first DevOps days. And he gave a talk, and he said, we do 10 deploys a day at Flickr. And after the talk, people came up to him and said, it is incredibly irresponsible of you to say that out loud in front of this many people. You should not, you should probably be fired for trying to do that. So you can think of the idea that 10 deployments in a day was completely out of, like, people were like, you're crazy. And that was 13 years ago. Now we have people, of course, doing, thousands of deployments a day. So the result of that and the way that this kind of frequency of deployment works is it shifts some of the focus from mean time between failure, so preventing failure, to mean time to recovery, making it safe to fail. This is a very important shift that happens in the community around how we think about development and operations and the relationship between them. Because when operators can finally start thinking about, my job is to make sure the system can recover, not my job is to protect the system from failing, that flip becomes an important part of how we see so much change in the way that software development is done, but also operations. The other thing that I always think is important to mention is that this is kind of like the secret sauce, right? This is why DevOps works. You can see here on the right-hand side, traditional operations. and the burden that's involved. And you can see the secret sauce or the DevOps style operational burdens, right? The meaning of this is just that you radically reduce the amount of effort it takes to operate a system, yeah? And that's really what we see when we see DevOps kind of work better, is that, you know, the secret sauce of something like Amazon Web Services is that they have one operator for 10,000 machines because they can do it, right? As opposed to having one operator per 100 machines, and that's kind of roughly what you see here. So the last thing I like to say about kind of the beginnings of DevOps, and this is something that I think when I talk to people, it's something that I don't always, I'm not always confident that this message gets out as well as it should. So, you know, there's been the traditional kind of grumpy way of saying it is that there's no such thing as a DevOps engineer, or you shouldn't call people DevOps engineers. You get somebody to wag your finger at you a little bit. I like to just point out this. Really, DevOps, if you're doing it well, is making your developers better developers because they understand their software in operation. In other words, you're making them be better developers because they've seen how their system works when it's actually operating, because they've actually talked to somebody who's seen it operating, yeah? And it's about making operators better operators by understanding how to apply software practices in operations. So this is, to me, it's important because it says that there's still two separate capabilities in the firm or in your organization. There's an operations capability and there's a development capability. And you can improve both of those capabilities by allowing them to interact better. So I hope that makes some sense. So what kind of shifts are we actually seeing out there right now in the marketplace when we talk to our customers and people? I think the two biggest ones are this. There's a significant movement from project to product. Everybody, if you've read Nick Kierson's book, this is a common pattern we see when we talk to people. You might see this as people adopting value streams, product lines, a product management mindset, flow-based metrics, all those ideas, right, that have to do with managing a product as a long-term investment as opposed to a project as a, you know, time-bound economic boundary. So that's a significant change, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, the way that that kind of plays into this stuff. But the second one I think that we're seeing in a lot of organizations, there's different versions of it, but we're seeing a movement from service to platform. So from service catalogs to platforms. And I like to try to say that, you know, there's two different things that are happening. There's two different levels of kind of complexity that are happening inside the organization. The first one is that when you adopt a product, you create a value stream from the product that says, like, this is where the idea starts, and here's how it gets processed, and here's how it gets into production, and that we can call that a value stream, yeah? And when you first do it, you might do it with one team or two teams, in which case you can have two different value streams. They're completely different value streams, and it doesn't matter. But when you're in a large company and you get to about 10 of these, all of a sudden people start going, well, how do we work together across value streams? Like, shouldn't we be having like a platform or something where some of the services that we're consuming aren't just our service? Like, do the value streams cross at some point? And in traditional manufacturing concepts, that's called a Y line, and that's what we're seeing in platforms, right? So it's the idea that at some point in your value stream, often you're going to go from just a single value stream to multiple value streams where the value streams start converging, yeah? And the convergence could be a platform, yeah? That could be what you're seeing. So we're seeing, because of this, a skills gap. And the skills gap, I think, is moving a little bit. Kind of traditionally, I think we would have talked about the skills gap being primarily a technical gap. But I like to say that right now what we're seeing is that there is a gap that is kind of the intersection of budgeting and organizational structure. So like, how are you organized? So again, moving from a product-based structure to a value stream structure significantly changes the way that your organization kind of flows and interacts. So the structure might change. And of course, moving from a product-based system to, a project-based system to a product-based system changes the way you budget, right? So completely different budgeting practices. And as a result of that, we're seeing also a new set of skills and practices that need to be adopted around things like cloud-native patterns and observability and microservices and FinOps and all these other ideas. So the skills gap that needs to be addressed in most organizations is that weird little intersection between these three things so that we start being capable of kind of adopting and implementing these new ideas. Especially platforms. So, the other thing that we're seeing in a lot of organizations, or the thing that I like to point out frequently, is it's almost impossible to build a platform for somebody. You have to build platforms with people. If you build a platform in isolation and try to force people to use it, they will find every reason to not use it. They hate that. So, one of the things I like to try to point out here is that the thing that you should be trying to achieve in your organization is not a technology. It's not a platform technology. It's a capability. Platforming, the ability to create and maintain a platform is what you want. And that's what you should focus on. And that is similar to DevOps, is an intersection or a conversation between operators and developers and product managers. It's like it's not about the technology. It's not about having it available. It's about having a conversation where people say, this is the next thing that I need, or the most important thing that I need, or this is how we're going to do code reviews. This is how we're going to do patch pushing across boundaries to make sure the platform can stay alive and capable. And this is the difference to me between kind of the traditional version of service as opposed to platform. So the traditional service concepts here, as represented in ITIL, which had a concept called service design, is about how you move the responsibility and risk from one group to another. In other words, the way that ITIL thinks about services is that the service provider takes the risk away from the service consumer. And in a lot of organizations, the way that would work is that you have a service catalog and you point at it and you say, that's our platform. And the result of it is that you actually have quite a bit of friction between the development and the service team, because the service team does not want you to do things with their service that would increase their risk, right? So it makes it very difficult to have a good conversation across this boundary, because it's not designed to do that. It's designed to create very stable, immutable services. So what we end up with is this idea that there's a lot of things, a lot of different contributing factors that go into creating a desirable platform that will be adopted in your organization. And you need to kind of think through them all, the ideas of kind of ecosystems and how ecosystems work, budgeting, and new practices and things like this, as well as financial feasibility and economic factors. And as a result of that, I think we get into this idea of socio-technical architecture. Nick Thune and a couple other people out there in the world use this term as well. Socio-technical architecture, I encourage you to kind of look up their work. In my version of it has more to do with kind of the way that socio-technical systems theory, kind of the idea that there's social systems and technical systems, and the interaction between the two is what enables technology to work. And I like to just point out that architecture and the architects in your organization, or the architectural capability of your organization, needs to be able to provide the lower half, which is kind of like saying, I like to call it load-bearing architecture. If you say this bridge will support a 10-ton truck, and I drive a 10-ton truck across it and it collapses, I'm not going to trust you anymore. Right? Same thing with architecture or your platform. If you tell your developers that the system can do something, and then they deploy onto it and it does not do that thing, they won't like that system anymore, right? You have to be able to deliver promises to the people that are consuming your platform, and the platform has to be able to actually do them. So that often looks like understanding what the golden signals are, how much throughput, latency, all those other things that you need to be able to provide for the developers in your organization to do it, and you have to be able to live by those things. But the second part of it is that you need to make the system observable or conceivable by the developers. They have to understand what it is. They have to understand how it works. And they have to understand the intersection between their platform and the way that different teams work within that platform, which is a social problem. It's not a technical problem. So both sides of this need to occur in your organization in order for the platform to be effective. So, operating models. Because of all this kind of changing, I think there's some changes that we're seeing in the way people operate, right? Cloud-native operating models, the ones that you would see in the FANG or the big whatever organizations that have kind of grown up cloud, have evolved to deliver high feature velocity and reliability at scale. So faster, safer is another way of saying it, right? And as a result of that, I think that most of them look like this. And I think it's interesting because I don't think many people necessarily think about this the right way. There's 3 layers, I think, in most organizations when we look. There's an infrastructure layer, there's a platform layer, and there's a software layer in the organizations that are doing this successfully. And the important thing that I will point out is that there's dev and ops at each layer. There's not like software and then operations. There's 3 layers of them. And in the organizations that are being most successful, they have a dev and ops organization at these 3 levels. So there's a platform dev team, and there's a platform ops team. There's an infrastructure dev team, and there's an infrastructure ops team. And then there's probably a bunch of applications riding on top of it, where you've got software development and software operations. So that the result of this is that at the very top of the organization, you have operators who are primarily concerned with whatever the specific operational concerns are for that application, as opposed to the platform infrastructure. As a result of this, we also get another weird thing. You get a lot of organizations we walk into, and they'll talk about the SDLC as the only cycle they have. But I think that this is something that we're going to see more and more people talk about, which is there's probably an infrastructure development lifecycle and a platform development lifecycle, because they operate on different kind of tempos, frankly. Like the cycle times are slightly different, and what you need to be able to do at each level is different. So organizations, I think, are going to start having less of a focus on just SDLC, and they're going to have to try to figure out these other life cycles. And I think that's especially going to be true in any regulated industry. As a result of this, we get this weird thing around pace layering, because these 3 different layers, right? And pace layering basically is this idea that if one layer moves faster than the others, you can get shearing between the layers, right? And so this ends up being another kind of that, like, one of those major shifts that happens in DevOps, which is how do you reduce that shearing? And the answer to shearing reduction is more frequent integration. So this becomes like even more critical for being able to reproduce your environments and your platforms quickly, because it reduces the cycle time between integrations. And one of the things I like to say to people, again, I tend to think that people think of they think of batch size often as a way of kind of releasing value into the market more quickly. Kind of that's the traditional agile theory. But I actually think that the important thing to understand about integration is that when you integrate, you release information into the organization. Yeah? So what you're doing is you're producing a report about the quality of the software. That's what integration testing does. And when you do that frequently, the amount of information that you release tends to be reasonably small. And therefore, most people can kind of like continue with their normal job while also looking at this information and modifying some things. If you do this like rarely, and you have kind of like merge parties and all these other activities that people do, you release a lot of information into the organization. And the result is you've got developers who have this weird thing in their lives where about 60% of the time they're like doing development stuff, and about 40% of the time they're fixing things. Like it's like they have schizophrenia. They flip back and forth between 2 different ways of working. And that flipping back and forth between the two ways of working is what causes the organization to have a hard time with this type of stuff. So reducing the batch size actually lets you stay in the same way of working and not flip back and forth between the two. I think that's really important. Werner, this is another kind of thing that I like to think people get confused about. Werner, this is a famous kind of quote. This is pre-DevOps too, but it's a famous quote. You build it, you run it. And people say this to me all the time. You build it, you run it. You need to have a single team. You need to do DevOps all the way across and everything. And that's right-ish. But Werner meant this, right? He meant you run it, you write it. You write it, you run it is for your application. At Amazon, you're not expected to run a platform or infrastructure. You're expected to run your application. So if you don't have the things lower, platform and infrastructure, well structured, you write it, you run it becomes an impossible task in most organizations. You can't do that. There's just no way to build an organization that has enough people that every single team can have their own platform and infrastructure at some scale. Smaller teams, certainly. And you can see this reflected in SRE. SRE talks about the idea that, that the platform, here they call it a framework, allows development teams to focus on business logic because the framework takes care of correct infrastructural use. Again, the platform here becomes a way in which the organization minimizes the load of maintenance and operation to a certain extent, and allows the development team to focus specifically on the development and operation of their application. So everybody wants to build software as a service, the top thing, when they haven't necessarily solved platforming and they aren't really doing infrastructure as software yet. So, you know, if you haven't done the lower two, if you haven't figured those out, you should expect that you're going to have some level of difficulty with the top. And one of the ways of kind of thinking about this is that is this kind of idea from Goldratt. Complexity inside systems, in order to deal with it, people tend to subdivide the system into smaller and smaller components, and then they optimize the components. I think what you will see in organizations is the components will be various applications which all have their own stack by themselves because it's just easier to deal with if you're a manager. I only want to deal with my thing. I don't want to care about anybody else in the organization. My thing's the thing I want to deal with. So I want my own stack. I don't want to have to share anything. And this, I think, from a management point of view, shouldn't be encouraged, right? What you need is to isolate the parts of the application that are actually valuable to the individual application, allow the developers to do that for their application, and encourage common reuse of common patterns and common components in order to reduce the complexity, not just dissect the complexity into smaller problems. So, 2 more things to do. I think I can get it done. The other thing we're seeing in organizations right now is a way in which the DevOps conversation that I started with is expanding. So I like to say kind of like, this was the first problem that we saw, right? Which was like, we got a bunch of agile developers, and there was a bunch of operators, and the real problem that the CIO and the CTO wanted to know was, how do we deploy faster? Now that developers are developing faster, how do we deploy faster? And this ends up being one of the major questions that we're trying to answer at the very beginning of the DevOps movement. And I think that the result is that we did that pretty effectively. We managed to figure out how to deploy faster. And it means that the constraint, so the original constraint was it's hard to get things into production. Once we lower the boundary there, the constraint moves. It's somewhere else. So where did it go? Well, I like to think that part of the problem is that we've had this effective conversation for about 13 years between developers and operators. But you know who we didn't talk to? Product managers and architects. Do they have anything to do with the things on the bottom? Probably. And so maybe this is where the constraint is moving. And when we look at that kind of idea, what we see is that there's these new questions that are coming into play in the organization. How is our architecture preventing us from deploying quickly to our environments? And how can we prioritize operational concerns and development concerns? Right, these are just some example questions that start happening, right? So architects now are being more and more engaged because how do we do microservices, et cetera? So this is the conversation that I think we need to start thinking about when we look at these things, is the conversation between, first, I think, product owners and architecture. I think if you have an architecture roadmap and you have a product roadmap and the product owners have not spoken to the architects about what they're doing and the architects have not spoken to the product managers about what they're doing, maybe there's something missing, and that's something that you should encourage them to do more frequently. And I think that what you see there already is some of these conversations happening. So you see microservices, lift and shift, DevSecOps, cross-cutting ops concerns. These are conversations between operations and architecture. These are primarily what those conversations are about, right? You see conversations about observability, service level objectives, and error budgeting as a conversation between ops and product. You see roadmaps, accelerating strategic options, and creating options as conversations that we're seeing between product owners and architects. And the result of this is we're seeing yet another Cambrian explosion. Now we're seeing another set of conversations that I believe will bring new capabilities, new practices into the marketplace. I think you should expect to see these types of conversations. You can kind of just mash these things up. What would architecture as a product be? What would architecture operations be? What would product operations be? How would you do something like dev architecture, right? What would these things be? What would these conversations be like inside of your organization? I think there's a huge amount of value to be had there. So how would you do this? How would you kind of like have these conversations? What are the tools that you might like take away from what I think happened early in the DevOps experience? DevOps was always largely about learning and sharing. Yeah, it was one of the two big kind of themes. And it's based on this kind of belief that learning and sharing was a personally fulfilling activity for developers and operators to do, that it's something that they should value. And the result of that is that you kind of get this optimizing of the human experience between these two groups, and you get a significant improvement in the outcome. And I think that is driven by a couple things. One is an idea from sci-fi, and it's called cognitive estrangement. And I think the way you notice cognitive estrangement is when you're having a conversation, you think, well, that's weird that you would say that. Or it's like they live on another planet. Or it's about people asking questions like, have you ever tried, or did you know that? And I think this, when you think about it, ends up being what happens originally in the DevOps conversation. The operators and the developers get together and like, that's so weird that you do that, right? But those moments of noticing that's weird is that you should like associate that directly with learning. I'm learning something right now because that person does something I don't expect them to do, yeah? Why do they do that? That's an opportunity to engage in a conversation, opportunity to learn. At the heart of all practice lies noticing. So this is a second kind of idea. Noticing what's happening, paying attention, trying to notice the difference between what your expectation was and what the outcome was. And noticing is another way of saying, what might I try out in the future? I noticed that you're doing something different than what I would do. Should I try that in the future? What could I do in order to do that? You get this idea from noticing that says, you know, you need to be present to what is happening. You need to have a purpose or understand the why of the other parties and your own why. You need to be able to think of and act on novel ways of solving problems, and practice explaining your decisions and practices in explicit ways. So again, DevOps was partially kind of effective by being more explicit about, can you tell me why you're doing that, right? And so the other way of saying it is that it's important to notice how things are framed, right? So that, again, throwing back to the beginning of the conversation, the reframing of the wall of confusion as a set of opportunities for discussions is a way of noticing how the system was framed. Metacognition, thinking about how we're thinking about something. Yeah? We need to be more careful to notice that we bring a certain frame into most conversations. And if we, to the best of our ability, if we can understand how we are making problems look certain ways by the way we frame them, so we can actively reframe problems in order to find new solutions. So as these conversations happen between the new groups that I was talking about, kind of product and architecture, dev and ops, what I would expect is a significant amount of reframing of the way that we talk about problems in order to find new solutions. So, DevOps is more than a simple set of methods or tools. It's a way of thinking, and this way of thinking continues to expand throughout organizations, improving cultures, reducing toil, and changing the work and the way we work for the better. I hope you will join us and help discover the next 10 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jabe. I couldn't imagine a better opening keynote for this conference because you really were going through, let's say, the foundations, where we're coming from, and giving us a super interesting outlook on what are the tasks for the future. Thank you so much, and I think some of the conversations are going to, not to start here, but going to happen over the next 2 days. So I wish you pleasure and lots of inspiration over the sessions, and we meet later right here for the next keynote. Enjoy the conference. Thanks.
Thank you.